Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Meredith Mann, and I'm curator of manuscripts and archival collections here at New York Historical. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Primary Source, a series of free and public programs exploring how the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society supports new research and historical inquiry. For over 200 years, the library has documented our shared history through manuscripts, books, maps, newspapers, photographs, architectural drawings, prints, and more. These primary sources are available to researchers, students, and all those curious about our past and present. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the New York Historical Society's Board of Trustees, its chair, Agnes Shu-Tang, our chair's council members, our members in the Leon Levy Foundation for their generous ongoing support of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library and our programs. Tonight, I am pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Catherine McNeur. Catherine is professor of history at Portland State University, where she teaches courses on global, urban, and American environmental history, the history of food, as well as public history courses focused on historic preservation, podcasting, urban parks, and heritage trees. She is the award-winning author of Taming Manhattan: Environmental Battles in the Antebellum City, published by Harvard University Press in 2014, and the focus of tonight's program, Mischievous Creatures, the Forgotten Sisters Who Transformed Early American Science. She has won numerous awards for her writing, including the American Society of Environmental Historians George Perkins Marsh Prize, as well as their Rachel Carson Prize, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic's James H. Broussard Prize, and Yale University's John Addison Porter Prize. Catherine is joined today by my colleague, Dr. Valerie Paley. Valerie Paley is Senior Vice President and the Sue Ann Weinberg Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library. Formerly New York Historical's Chief Historian, she is founding director of its Center for Women's History, the first such center in the United States within the walls of a major museum. She also was responsible for developing New York Historical's joint MA program in museum studies with the CUNY School of Professional Studies, which launched in fall 2019. The program will run for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. At any time during our program tonight, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature located on your screen, and we will answer as many questions as we can. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Catherine and Valerie.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And it's a thrill to see you again, Catherine, old colleague and also former fellow at the New York Historical Library not too long ago when you were just out of grad school. So wonderful to see you again, Catherine.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a thrill. And it's also a thrill to read this extraordinary narrative, this book, Mischievous Creatures, the Forgotten Sisters Who Transformed Early American Science. So it is about the sister scientists, Margaretta and Elizabeth Morris, who lived in the Germantown, Philadelphia area in the early to mid 19th century. So just please frame the story for us a bit before we launch into our conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So Margaretta Hare Morris was one of the first women who was elected to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She was an entomologist who studied a lot of pests, insects that were bothering farms and orchards. Her sister was a botanist, and the two of them, her sisters, Elizabeth Carrington Morris, and they were really at the center of early American scientific culture and conversations, but likely very few people have ever heard their names before. I had never heard of their names before I stumbled upon their papers, some of their letters in the New York Historical Society's collection.
It's a wonderfully sort of lucid account of their life and times, and certainly the context in which they lived. And your writing is just breathtakingly beautiful. I wonder if you might just read us an opening passage to help us set the stage.
Sure. Yeah, I'll read the start of chapter 1. So Margaretta Hare Morris and Elizabeth Morris were happiest outdoors. They certainly spent considerable time there as adults, Margaretta galloping on horseback across fields to visit neighbors or hunched over the edge of a lake, losing track of time while observing water beetles. Elizabeth, for her part, took off for the forest with her tin vasculum case thrown over her shoulder, filled with her lunch, tools, papers, and everything else to separate whatever specimens she gathered. As scientists in midlife, they reminisced with peers about what drew them to their specialties: botany for Elizabeth, entomology for Margaretta. Like anyone looking backward with hindsight, they sought roots as if the seeds had been sown early, and all of these formative memories were outdoors. Elizabeth, ever the romantic, remembered having her eyes cast wistfully toward distant worlds far from her childhood home in Philadelphia. I used to want to set out on my travels in search of adventures and flowers, she wrote, quote, like the heroines of fairy tales, for then as now, flowers were my diamonds. As an adult, she would come to possess bookshelves filled with bound descriptions and lithographs of these exotic plants, an enviable herbarium with pressed specimens, and a carefully tended garden full of gifts from botanists around the world. Those men who sent the seeds, rhizomes, and plants were the ones who were able to go on the expeditions that Elizabeth dreamed of. Margaretta's origin story remained closer to home as she recalled, quote, the world of wonders open to the solitary child in a rotten apple or a decayed log and pear. While butterflies might have paired well with the flowers her sister and many other American girls collected, Margaretta was less interested in those than she was in the insects typically considered pests. Housekeeping manuals and agricultural journals regularly gave tips on how to kill all kinds of insects with arsenic, tobacco, cobalt, and boiling water. But Margaretta preferred to capture and observe the creatures. Nothing about her obsession with her, quote, little friends, the insects, embarrassed her as a child or an adult, and she breathlessly filled letters and conversations with friends about her latest findings.
Such evocative prose. I mean, I just felt like I was in their world from your writing. But speaking of writing, how did you come to write this book?
Yeah, so this wasn't the book I intended to write. I had actually set out to write a book about the tree of heaven, or the tree that grows in Brooklyn, which is now considered to be an invasive species, but it was a plant that people really loved in the early 19th century, and then it became hated. So I was looking at this, like the racism, it's a Chinese tree, and there was a lot of racism tied into it's going out of style. And I was about 2 years into that project, and I was at the New York Historical Society for a meeting, and I happened to have a few hours before my flight home to do some research in the library. And I was looking at various nursery catalogs and sea catalogs, and the archivist in the reading room at that day said, you might check out the papers of William Darlington. He wrote about ailanthus trees in a book about American weeds in the 1840s, and maybe there's something in his papers. We have all his letters, and not many people use them. And so I went to the finding aid. I didn't have much time. It was kind of the end of my research time. And so I just looked through the finding aid and found there were 250 letters from a woman named Elizabeth Morris. And it was the most of all of the correspondence. William Darlington was a botanist from Westchester, Pennsylvania, so kind of just outside of Philadelphia. And he was really organized. He kept an amazing herbarium and kind of curiosity cabinet in Westchester. He kept like a museum essentially. And he also really organized his letters in a beautiful way. And so he kept these 2 bound volumes that are full of letters from women scientists, which is pretty remarkable. And Elizabeth Morris was the person who he corresponded with most of any gender. He was really closely connected with Elizabeth Morris. So I did what anybody would do. I never heard her name before, but I figured she must be important if there's so many letters. I Googled her and nothing showed up. There was no Wikipedia page at the time. There is now. It's still small. It could be used more, but there was no Wikipedia page. There was no real anything about her. A little bit more digging, I found that her sister was a well-known entomologist, but again, nobody had really written anything about her. I jotted their names down in my notebook and went home. And that's interesting. Then it happened to be that the next month I was giving a talk at MIT, and I had a day to do research at Harvard's library and was looking at the papers of an entomologist who had written about a dropworm that had infested urban trees, but not the tree of heaven. Anyway, I again coincidentally stumbled on the letters from Margaretta Morris this time. And in this case, her words just stopped me in my tracks. It was more than the finding aid. So it was more than just a list of letters. It was the actual physical letters. And I could tell I was stepping into the middle of some fight she was having with an entomologist. And she was sort of trying to make friends with like an enemy of some sort. And she said something in the letter that she was like, I have panted for the sympathy of someone who could respect my love of the science and look past the fact that I'm a woman and that I don't have access to the same libraries and collections that men have. And I remember just being like, I went to dinner with a friend that night in Boston. I was like, I think I'm putting this tree book aside. I think I'm captivated by these women. I want to learn more about these Morris sisters, and who I just keep coincidentally, falling upon. And, here we are 7 years later.
Well, it was like they were reaching out to you in a strange sort of way, and that you just happened upon them. You weren't looking for them in either case. And they obviously, these are lives that fell into important lives in the 19th century that over time fell into a kind of obscurity. So how did you go about finding them then in the archive? If there was no really deep information, or their papers weren't placed anywhere in particular?
It was, a lot of their papers were scattered. So there'd be a few letters in the papers of a male scientist whose papers were at the University of Pennsylvania or at Penn State or University of Michigan. There'd be a couple scattered things here and there. And luckily now that with digitization, it made it very possible to find these needles in a haystack. If it was like 30 years earlier, no one could have ever found it. And luckily their brother-in-law, all the descendants of their brother-in-law donated their papers to the University of Delaware. And so and their papers got kind of lopped into that collection. So I was able to find a lot of their poetry and artwork and things that, again, when historians were trying to recover women's history in the sciences in the 70s, they would have never had access to this because it was donated in the early 2000s. And then there's a collection at the Library of Congress. The most magical collection, though, that I found was at the end of this project, I thought I was done with the research. I was writing chapter 10. I was pretty much wrapping everything up. And it happened to be right smack in the middle of the height of the pandemic. And so my kids didn't have after school care. So I was on the playground a lot more and talking to a dad who was waiting for his kids on the playground. And he's telling me about his insurance business, and I'm telling him about the book, and he's asking me who the scientists are, and he just nodded along. And then a month later, his babysitter had COVID, so he's back on the playground. He said, "I think I'm related to these scientists you're writing about." Now, all of my research is like East Coast. It's all New York down to Pennsylvania and Delaware. It's at the University of Cambridge. It's it's not. I live in Oregon. I didn't expect anything to be here. And he said not only is he related to them, so this is like mind-blowing that a descendant is at my kid's school, that my daughter is friends with one of the descendants of one of their brother. But also his uncle lived in lives in Hood River, and had one of their albums, had Margaretta's album in his attic. What was sort of crazy about this, the chapter I was writing, chapter 10, is where both sisters die. And Elizabeth, these two sisters, these two women, they lived together their entire lives. They never live apart. And after Elizabeth dies, I didn't have anything. I had Margaretta's will, but she just stopped publishing. She stopped writing things. I had no material about that. But this album that I found, like I uncovered this in the middle of the Omicron surge or whatever. I went to the uncle's house and got to look at the album. It had her poetry that she wrote about her grief, losing her sister. It had a painting she made in honor of the year anniversary of her sister. And so it ended up kind of filling in all those gaps right when I needed it. It really just fell into my lap in again, it's kind of mind-blowing way. I don't know how to put it.
It was just meant to be. It's truly meant to be. I love that when our primary sources just sort of happen like that. There they are. We'll get back to the sisters, but I just want to also look a bit at the context of the early 19th century. the early republic, enlightenment, all of these things that were taking center stage with knowledge, and in particular women's education, the whole idea of republican motherhood. These women were being educated in order to have them be good mothers to future leaders of the United States. Tell us a bit about like women's education in general, and how privileged these sisters were to receive the kind of education they did, or if it differed that much from boys' educations.
Yeah, something that I found that it surprised me, especially because of our current discussions about getting women into STEM, the kind of push towards that, was that in the early 19th century, before the sciences were really a profession, before you could actually get a paying job in the sciences, it wasn't typical to have boys trained in the sciences. It was much more typical to see the sciences offered in girls' schools, because it wasn't a job. It was like art. It was like the equivalent of someone training to be an artist now. It's not, you don't assume that they're going to have a lucrative future. And that's what was true for the scientists at that time. Men were pursuing science as well as women, but they were going to medical school and getting science training that way, and then going into the sciences. But really, Margaretta and Elizabeth and a lot of the women of their generation, another class too, kind of upper middle class and wealthy Americans, had access to it because it was really a way for private schools to like show off what a great curriculum they had, that they have chemistry, and that they have advanced biology, and that you could learn the natural sciences, you could learn geology, all that sort of stuff at these girls' schools. Once it becomes a profession, you see it take off in the boys' schools too. Once the boys don't have to just be training for law or entrance exams that involve Latin and Greek and that sort of thing, then you see the sciences start to move into boys' schools too. But it really, yeah, these girls and then women had really the best education, the scientific education. And because boys couldn't be trained, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, also how these sisters, but others like them, were tutored in the sciences as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's
by male tutors, but
right. The male tutors who couldn't make ends meet, and so they were tutoring to kind of live hand to mouth as scientists, and that's how Margaret and Elizabeth were trained by really the so-called founding fathers of American science.
And I find it fascinating because the early male naturalists were they took great pride in their passion for the science, but they didn't want to make money on it, which is one reason why they were impoverished tutors, right? Which is so interesting. It was, redounded to women's education, and these girls in particular. But I'm also interested in you quote a William Whewell, I guess is pronounced the way you pronounce his name, about who believed that women's brains worked more coherently to better articulate scientific concepts. And is that true? I mean, I think that these sisters were exceptional, that they could articulate things in a very clear way. But that jumped out at me in a way.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's both an honor and a curse to be told that your brain works differently, right? And he was the person who coined the word scientist, and which was meant to be a gender inclusive word, because it was he was referencing Mary Somerville, the astronomer and mathematician from England, who had been able to write these really cohesive books that brought together all the sciences that were starting to splinter off. And so he saw that her woman's brain could then work in this very coherent way to like bring all the sciences together. And he wanted to come up with a word that would be gender neutral, because it was, I mean, that was part of it. And it was also, he wanted some overall umbrella that would encompass the botanists and the entomologists and the geologists and everybody. And so they had a unifying kind of umbrella name. It took a while to catch on. Male scientists still wanted to be called a man of science, or a naturalist or whatever, but they really clung on to the man of science and kept it more gender exclusive that way too.
I find it's so fascinating too about the sort of gendered aspect of what you call yourself, that role as scientist. The word scientist was not really considered it's almost not a compliment to be called a scientist. You were a naturalist or a man of science. Why was that? I mean, did you come to any conclusion about that.
Yeah, historians of science have written a little bit about this, and it goes. I mean, like the British scientists saw it as an Americanism, even though it was created. William Ewell was a British person, but he like they blamed the Americans for it, so it was like this distant. It was and then I don't know. It was just it was seen as kind of just a butchering of it. I don't know. It was the silly culture of science at that time. But I do think that there was some genderedness to it too, like that it was just esteemed to be considered a man of science. And if you started to kind of call yourself a scientist, like an artist or a lawyer or whatever, like had this umbrella, then it becomes, I don't know, it was somehow lessened somehow.
It's so interesting how these words evolve over time. You even the word amateur, for example, you're an amateur something is not necessarily a bad thing to be called back in the 19th century.
No,
Right?
it was preferred if you were an amateur, it meant that you were doing something for the love of it. And it meant that you weren't corrupted by money and anything else, that you weren't, you know, a geologist who had a mining contract and therefore had a reason to discover whatever you were discovering. So if you were doing it for free, it was a sign that you were a pure scientist. And then as the sciences professionalize and it becomes a career and there are university positions and the government positions and museums are opening, then the amateur thing becomes a non-expert and it becomes more associated with people who don't have access to education, which increasingly are women or other marginalized people.
I find that fascinating, and also the idea that professionalizing science then relegates women to the margins, as where they were once doing the very things that men were doing. They were then tasked with like collecting specimens or doing menial tasks. But that didn't necessarily harm the trajectory, professional trajectory of Margaretta and Elizabeth. They were so engaged deeply in science, entomology, and botany. I learned more about bugs reading your book than I ever really wanted to know about. But they had very different, they were both brilliant women, but they had very different personal approaches, and they grew up together and never married, lived together all their lives, and just like went out to the creek out back, and their backyard was like this treasure trove of specimens, and they mined it deeply. So tell us a little bit about the two, Elizabeth and Margaretta, and what their approaches were to science.
Yeah, they were, I mean, one of the joys of studying sisters is that it's almost like the way that people or psychologists will study twins, and that you can be like, well, this is nurture versus nature or whatever. With these sisters, they come from identical backgrounds. They have the same tutors, they have the same library in their house, they have the same social connections, and yet they took two very different paths with the ways that they did science. Margaretta took more of or kind of what we envision as a traditional pioneer, sort of like a pathbreaker sort of role. She edged her way into scientific debates and kind of elbowed her way into these conversations, got into fights like the fights that I uncovered when I was at Harvard's library, battles with people over Hessian flies and cicadas. And other insects. She actually, that's another story later for a tangent, but that she discovered a cicada species that is now emerging in the Midwest. But then
Really?
somebody stole credit
The
for
smaller one, the little
the
one
smaller
versus
one.
the big one. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And she was very active in that. The potato blight was affecting Ireland. She got in the middle of that and started like making hypotheses about the interaction of beetles with potatoes and things like that. Elizabeth, on the other hand, she wanted no credit. She didn't want to publish anything under her own name. She hid behind pseudonyms. She wrote prolifically in agricultural journals, but kept it all anonymous. She didn't want credit when she would paint and illustrate forestry books, and she took no credit. She didn't want her name on the lithograph. At one point she had sent in a poem about agricultural fairs or something like that to William Darlington, the namesake for the Darlington papers, and his son published it in a newspaper and credited her, and she exploded and said, I nearly had a heart attack. I never want to see my name in print again. So she really worked behind the scenes. She was a network builder, kind of what we'd call soft skills now. She would connect botanists with other botanists. and was very much a community builder. And in some ways, she helped Margaretta. When Margaretta started making discoveries, Elizabeth would kind of strategize with her about how to bring in men to their garden so that they can endorse her work and sort of move her own career forward too. So they worked really well together, playing these different kinds of roles.
It's fascinating. And they both wrote prolifically. Oh, I'm curious, how did you know that that was their writing? If
Oh,
they wrote anonymously for
yeah.
most of their careers, yeah. Except
Yeah, up until,
Margaretta ultimately did credit herself.
yeah,
I'm fascinated. She called herself the old lady, which was
right.
just, why would she use such a
I know.
deprecating
She wasn't
pseudonym?
that old. She was probably in her
And she wasn't
40s.
old.
I think, yeah,
Right,
I mean, she was in her
right,
40s.
right.
Yeah, so what happened was Margaretta did not get an obituary when she passed away, but Elizabeth did. When Elizabeth passed away, she had been contributing to a magazine called the Gardener's Monthly. And though she would have hated this, the editor of the Gardener's Monthly wrote an obituary for her and credited her and said, readers, you'll know her because she's one of your beloved writers. Here are some of her pseudonyms. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. And so I followed that trail and discovered that. And then through some of those pseudonyms, discovered she had been writing in the American Agriculturist too. When I was at the University of Delaware, I was able to even come across even more of her pseudonyms because she kept a book where she kept her drafts of the articles.
Wow.
And so I was able to find that she was posing as a man who wanted to know about trees. She was posing as someone named Americanus or whatever. And then I could cross list a lot of the stuff and discover. I'm sure there are some of her articles I didn't uncover, but it was like deep, like a cold case detective work to
Sure. How
uncover.
exciting is that? I love that. I'm a nerdy historian like that. I
Yeah,
love,
right.
love finding stuff like that. But I'm curious. Okay, so Margaretta, on the other hand, wrote for science journals under the old lady pseudonym, but then M.H. Morris, which is sort of gender neutral, um, and Elizabeth for the agricultural periodicals. Were they very different in language and tone? Were the science journals, vetted the way they might be now, or was there a big difference in the way they wrote, and these periodicals
Yeah.
that they wrote for?
And they both wrote for the American Agriculturist. It was geared towards farmers, but and farmers' families. So there was a more kind of conversational nature to it, but it wasn't that far off from the kind of publications that were coming out of the American Philosophical Society or the Academy of Natural Sciences. These agricultural journals were really sort of popular science journals of the time. Like they were the equivalent of Scientific American. And really Scientific American starts like another decade later and kind of picks up at that point. It's all kind of the same moment. And just kind of pop history, pop science rather, and they were writing in that way. The stuff that was published for the Academy of Natural Sciences that Margaretta wrote under her own name, there was a bit more formality, or she'd skip over some of the explanation about life cycles, about bugs and things like that. She'd assume some knowledge of her readership that she didn't necessarily assume of families reading the agricultural papers. But it really was all sort of and there was some minor peer review happening at the American Philosophical Society that we would expect today, even though peer review really doesn't take off until the 1950s. It's much
Right.
later.
Yeah.
But it's more this kind of the agricultural journals is like a chaotic peer review because it's like people just like hammer back their own theories with letters to the editor, and so you're getting kind of anonymous. It's almost like internet culture of anonymity, where it was like vicious anonymous letters coming back saying this lady doesn't know what she's talking about or whatever, and it goes too
I
far.
find it fascinating, though, that farmers and people in agriculture were reading this kind of stuff. I mean, sometimes we think of farmers in the 19th century as not being terribly literate, and they would have had to be to read their work, I would think, which I found fascinating. But I also, we would be remiss to not mention that Margaretta was one of two women elected to the American Academy of Science in 1850, with the more famous Maria Mitchell, the astronomer. Um, by that point, she was pretty well known for what she was doing in entomology. Like, what was it exactly? Was it the cicada or the Hessian fly, or what was it that gave her notoriety in science?
It was the cicadas. When she had made some discoveries with wheat, and that was more it was kind of a learning experience for her with wheat flies because she was really attacked. And that was that fight that I had fallen into.
Mhm.
By the time she got to the cicadas, she made these discoveries that cicadas, how they were living underground, how they were sucking from roots, and then she also discovered this new species of cicada. And because of Elizabeth's kind of strategizing and her network building, they brought in famous scientists to their garden. So Louis Agassiz from Harvard, who's known for his pseudoscience around race and everything else, but he was a main zoology kind of celebrity scientist of the time period. He came to their garden and witnessed it, and then they did that with multiple scientists that came in and did the same thing. And then Louis Agassiz was president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he nominated both Maria Mitchell and Margaretta Morris that same year to become the first women elected to the association. So like you could see how this was kind of spiraled. There were constant articles about cicadas coming out and all mentioning Margaretta. So she became well known, even though we don't know her name today.
That's
Really.
interesting. And also just strategies for how to protect your trees and your crops from
Yeah.
this invasive bug. But speaking of Agassiz, there are so many famous people who make an appearance in this story, and not tangentially. They're pretty important to the sisters. Asa Gray, Darwin, Andrew Jackson Downing, and importantly Dorothea Dix.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit about some of those and how those relationships were forged?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, first, can I start with Dorothea Dix? Because
Please.
I am pretty confident that Margaretta Morris was in a relationship with Dorothea Dix, the head of the Civil War nurses, the reformer. She Margaretta makes reference to the fact that she burns her letters, her love letters and things. There's not very much that exists, but there are some very familiar letters that are in the archives. And then really in the University of Delaware's collection, there's a wooden cross that has both of their initials on either side of it that Dorothea Dix gave to Margaretta. And I was like, I think that's the smoking gun. Like there's also some kind of love poetry that's in Dorothea Dix's hand.
How did they come to meet each other? I don't remember.
Hey, Dorothea Dix was really a scientist on her own right. She had
Mhm.
written a book of flower poetry very early on in her life, in her 20s. And I think they were connected through like this kind of high society sort of networks with friends in Rhode Island. And then all got to know each other in I think the 1820s, but then really came together in the 1840s and 50s. And they continued to supply her with stuff when she was in the Civil War and send her coffee and send her money and everything like that too, which is kind of amazing. And Dorothea Dix's handwriting is terrible. I think
Oh,
has bad handwriting anyway, but like I think writing on stagecoaches while traveling too, and so it's just horrendous trying to make sense of what she's saying. But Darwin is another major player, and and Asa Gray for that matter too, and they're good friends. Asa Gray is really close with and really relies on Elizabeth Morris for his career growth. And Darwin learns of Margaretta's discoveries about water beetles and has all these kind of letters back and forth to try to determine, as he's writing on the origins of species and try to figure out species distribution. So these kind of big players, these women are really kind of a part of these major conversations about evolution
excellent.
and
And holding
species.
their own in those conversations too. That was fascinating. Incidentally, to our audience, please, we're opening up the floor for questions. So while I'm waiting for someone to come over the transom, I'll ask you another question, and that is, who are the mischievous creatures? Of your
Yes.
title. What
In
are
some
they?
ways, they're the mischievous insect pests that drew Margaretta into these public conversations. But they're also, in many ways, the sisters themselves, because, or at least, I don't think they would have seen themselves as being mischievous, but I think others saw them as mischievous, as kind of edging their way into these conversations where they may or may not have belonged. And some of the men who were working with them promoted them and gave them a platform, but some did not and were intimidated or wanting to edge them out. And so in some ways they were themselves very mischievous.
Yes, no, I loved that double entendre. I thought it was great. Let's see, we have a couple of questions coming up here. someone suggests that the mischievous creatures were the men who pushed down the women in
Oh,
science
yes.
historically. That's great. That's yet another interpretation for that. One of our audience members wonders what religion the sisters were.
Their father was Quaker, and that was a major reason why they were given the same opportunities education-wise as their brother was. But their mother was Episcopalian, and eventually the father dies when they're very young, and they all convert to Episcopalian. Their great aunt is a woman named Elizabeth Powell, who was a major real estate mogul in Philadelphia and good friends with George Washington and others. And she was a big proponent of women's education too. So in many ways, their family in general and their religion kind of gave them that boost in terms of the tutoring and being treated as an equal to their brother.
You see a lot of that in that period, 1848 or so. The Quakers of Seneca Falls, for example, those women that Lucretia Mott and even Maria Mitchell, these were educated women who believed in and had very progressive ideas about women's education and everything else. And I think that has a lot to do with the Quakers, or Quakerism.
Yeah.
Let me see. Here's another question. You mentioned that one sister painted. Did the sisters include drawings in their letters?
Yes, they have them in their letters, but more of their paintings are in these albums that they kept. So they kept these things called friendship albums that they would kind of share with friends who would put in poetry or paintings, and they would themselves copy poetry in and paint also. And actually, all the book cover, I have no, show you. The book cover is covered in these like paintings, and those are actually it's the book cover artist pulled components of about 6 or 7 of their different paintings and put them on there. And some of this is from the attic in Oregon and out here in Oregon, which is
Beautiful.
just,
Yeah. And some of the
It's really,
examples, even in the book, are great. These little
they're
sketches
breathtaking.
and
Yeah.
drawings, they're so pretty. Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Were you saying?
Oh, no,
Say
no, it's
something?
just,
All
yeah, they're
right.
very rich colors. It's good.
Another question. Did you find examples of other women scientists who credited the Morris sisters as inspiration for entering the field?
You know, they were erased rather early on. And so there were some women who they had a kind of a large network of friends who were involved in the sciences and who would go out into the to the Wissahickon Creek and other areas with them on like botanizing adventures. And so there was this large community. Sort of when these women were not allowed in scientific associations, they sort of made their own sort of ad hoc scientific associations with these picnics and like they'd go to lectures at night and things like that. So there was this kind of community that was all inspired by itself. But afterwards, the generations afterwards, you don't actually see too many women crediting or anybody mentioning them because they were like a large part of this project is like, why didn't I know about them? How did I not, how do we come to forget them? Or why do we keep stumbling upon hidden figures like this? And so I was tracing a lot of the erasures over time, like their house was torn down. The collection at the Library of Congress is named for Asa Gray because he's the most famous and marketable name in the pile. There's a lot of different kinds of erasures that happened even somewhat during their lifetime when some men tried to discredit Margaretta or they stole the name of the cicada. It's Cason's cicada, but it should be Morris's cicada. So anyway, there are these like different erasures that happen over time. And in that way, their stories were sort of erased. And that the problem of that erasure is that women who wanted to enter entomology or other fields or botany or anything in sciences, they don't know about these founding kind of mothers of the scientific field. And so they're recreating the wheel again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, we can talk about erasure in a minute, but I also wanted you to tell our audience a bit about what these women wore when they went out on their hikes to the creek to collect specimens and such, and how complicated that was in the 19th century.
Yeah, and they weren't so progressive that they were wearing bloomers, but when like the first articles for bloomers started coming out in the Water Cure Journal and elsewhere, it was really tied to science. It was like articles kind of pushing like if you wore bloomers you can go ford the river and climb the rocks and do what you needed to do. The Morris sisters weren't that into kind of being that progressive. They wanted to keep their skirts, but they wear like thick brown dresses that and rubber boots was a big one that they advocated that other women learn to wear rubber boots and kind of take on essentially men's shoes. It was like military shoes, but it was effective because then you could go outside and not get your feet wet. Elizabeth hated that. She thought it was really ugly and she was really embarrassed by her boots. She continuously was like kind of like talking about how they're so ugly, they don't look good. But Margaretta loved them. She was like, whatever, I like my hood, I like my rubber boots, I don't care as long as I'm not getting wet.
Dig around and look for bugs in her boots.
Yeah, but because they wanted their dresses, they wanted to continue wearing dresses, they just designed wheelbarrows that wouldn't trip them up, like with longer handles, and they'd find other ways to have tools that would work with their dresses along the way.
I just imagine, and you evoke that, the image of them in their boots and their dresses so well. Here's another question. While they had no children themselves, were the sisters involved in education for children?
That was kind of typical of this time period for women who, especially they didn't have a ton of money. They came from a wealthy family, but their father died early and was in debt. And so they were kind of scraping together with like the support of their great aunts. So it was typical of this generation, these women who were not married, to go into education. They were working actually with Louisa May Alcott's father, Bronson Alcott, started a kindergarten in Germantown, and they were working in that kindergarten for a little while. They were actually there when Louisa May Alcott was born. So, and they were friends with Abba Alcott too. So again, like famous people just circling
another
around them.
one.
Yeah, exactly. But Elizabeth was involved and liked it. Margaretta hated it, and she would just go off into the city to go to bookstores or to go off botanizing. And some of the other friends who were working there were just like, "Where is Margaretta? Why does she keep disappearing?" So it didn't end up being their calling or their avocation. They were much more into the sciences. So, but they dabbled briefly in the kindergarten world.
And famous, and with the famous Alcott kindergarten too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. How did the Morris sisters and other women of their time balance the domestic tasks that were expected of them as women with their scientific pursuits?
That was a major issue for them. They, even though they weren't married, and they had other sisters who did marry and who were interested in the sciences, and they just stopped doing sciences once they got married and had children, or they kind of continued to dabble, but weren't nearly as involved as Margaret and Elizabeth. Though they didn't marry, they were responsible for the healthcare of all of their family members. So if their sister got sick, if their great aunt got sick, if their mother was sick, and their mother she lived a really long time and they were caring for her, and they felt really trapped in the house. So they would be caring for her in the house and taking turns caring for her. But then like Margaretta wrote about dreaming of like looking for Luna moths in the forest, that her heart was in the forest and she wanted to return to that. Or Elizabeth was like, I'm turning into a housewife, my brain is atrophying. So they were really struggling with that, the balance of the caretaking that was still required of them with the scientific work that they really wanted to be doing. And so there was, even though they didn't marry, it was still a major part of their life.
Sure. In many ways, it probably they were leaned upon even more because they were not married. They didn't have that extra responsibility of children, etc. Here's a question: has there been any attempt to rename the cicadas to recognize Morris?
That's a good question. So in 2021, when Brood 10 came out, I wrote a short article for Scientific American about the stealing of the name. And the cicada, like the entomologists who specialize in cicadas, read that and emailed me like almost immediately after it was published, saying that they are working on, they were like there's a big movement in the in like biology right now to rename or to right the wrong. So I guess the American Ornithology Society has tried to correct these things with birds and not naming or changing the names of birds that are named after humans, since so many are kind of troublesome paths of, whatever, like tied into slavery or other things like that. So just taking the human level out of it. Entomologists are also trying to right wrongs, and so they put forward a motion to change the name of Cason's cicada to Morris's cicada. We'll see what happens. Maybe we should just take the names out, but it'd be nice for her to get credit too.
That would be nice. That would be great. Yeah. Just a question about your process. You researched and wrote much of this book during COVID. What was that experience like? Were there particular challenges to your process?
It was hard. I have two small kids, and so we had remote school, and my husband was also working remotely here. So that was, I mean, I think noise canceling headphones was a major part of it. I was lucky also that I had done most of the research, probably like 90% of the research, in 2018 and 19, and so had like 10,000 digital photos that I was still processing. So I was able to do so much locally. And then also archivists were amazing in terms of, when people were allowed in archives, or when the archivists were allowed in the archives, people would send me scans. I was getting from the herbarium at Kew Gardens, they were sending me scans of ferns that they had collected from, that they found that Elizabeth had sent over. So anyway, I was able to get a lot of materials digitally. I was very lucky, but
Well, that's the wonderful thing about, the digital age now with our
yeah.
research as historians. But the follow-up question to that is, were there any sources or documents that you wanted to find but couldn't locate?
Oh, yeah, they talk about having kept diaries, daily diaries. They make reference to it in some of their letters. And I don't know what happened to those. Are they
Oh.
it's kind of destroyed, or I don't know if they destroyed them, or their descendants destroyed them, or just, or maybe they're not, maybe they're in someone's attic still, who knows?
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly letters that Margaretta burned, like her very personal letters. She kept a lot of her, more professional things, but the personal stuff is kind of hard to find.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, if I could make up an art, like because these sisters lived together their whole lives, they didn't leave much record of them communicating with each other. They're in the same
Right.
house, like shouting across the house, and they didn't write
Right.
letters unless they were traveling apart from each other. And so not having that was really hard to kind of build their relationship. I found ways when they wrote anonymously, they'd poke fun at each other. Margaretta, as the old lady, would mention how Betsy was so old fashioned with her recipes or something like that, and you could see them kind of poking fun at each other. And that was a way to get at that, but that was tricky.
Question: do any specimens from the sisters survive?
Yes, Elizabeth's botanical specimens are scattered all over really the country, but also all over the world, really. Her ferns are at Kew Gardens. She has stuff in Russia. There's a lot of materials in Westchester, Pennsylvania in William Darlington's collections, but they're all over the place. There's stuff
How
at
do you know they're
Harvard.
her specimens? Or that,
Yeah,
she didn't
it'll
like
say
to
the
be.
collector.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
sometimes it'll have her notes that she sent to William Darlington say on it.
Mhm.
Other times it'll be he logged it and said it was from E. Morris. And so I was able to kind of trace that back. Or it'd have her letter telling him that she's sending X, Y, and Z specimens. And then they're in the collections at Westchester.
That's great.
And Asa Gray took a lot of her specimens and then sent them worldwide
Mhm.
to because it was a way that he gained power. And so her stuff is all over the place. Elizabeth or Margaretta's bugs, their own personal herbariums and collections of bugs. I don't know what happened to that. They're easy to destroy. Pests will eat these
Mhm.
things if they're not really well cared for. So it's very likely they just got destroyed. There is also a large rodent that a Dasyprocton niger that they donated. It's a South American rodent. It's taxidermied and it's in the basement of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. That was one of my weirder archival moments where I was left with the mammal guy was like, here it is. You can spend some time with it. I'm like,
Maybe not.
what to do? Here I am with this like smiling rodent. I don't know.
But their hands touch this thing, or
Yeah,
somebody
right.
did taxidermy. Um, you know, you end on a poignant note about erasure, the idea of erasure, and how these women were forgotten, not only in terms of the historical record, but their home was raised to create a school, and so too was the backyard where all their science went on. Um, so, with that in mind, what is your hope for the legacy of the sisters now that you've been able to somewhat, revive their story and resuscitate them?
It'd be wonderful, for their story to become better known, maybe through the cicada name, maybe just through the book, and whatever the case is. Uh, that alone is at least a way to get that story started again, and to
Mhm.
get more people maybe researching them and including them in stories about American science, so that they're returned into the history of science where they've been kind of erased over time. And also, when I was doing all this research, it's very easy to get depressed by these erasure stories and to kind of just like looking at that sort of violence that's done to the historical record, to the ways that we tell history and tell stories. But one thing I found hope in just in this research was that the sisters themselves found a lot of joy. And despite whatever antagonisms or whatever was coming their way, they found joy just going out, and they would just continue no matter what was happening. The two of them would go off on an adventure, and their ideal day was if they were both together at the Wissahickon Creek going in search of an orchid or a fern or a beetle that was hiding in the skunk cabbage, and kind of having these adventures on a sunny day. It was like their ideal. And then telling people about what they found and illustrating what they found and kind of exploring a puzzle of some sort. And that I find inspirational.
Oh, what a beautiful and inspiring life. Would you like to end us with maybe an excerpt from
Oh, sure.
the book?
I will, here, hold on one second.
There are so many wonderful set pieces there that you know, you could pick any number of them, but maybe to end on a semi-inspirational note.
Yes, I'll try. Okay. Okay. Margaretta and Elizabeth Morris were both exceptional and unexceptional. They were closely connected and indispensable to powerful scientists. They published widely, and they were recognized for their accomplishments on a level that few were able to achieve. They were also part of a vast culture that embraced science in the early 19th century, and they rank among many marginalized scientists who were erased and forgotten over time. If we only talk about exceptional women, the path breakers, we miss the bigger city. A bigger story, excuse me. In this chaotic moment in the 19th century, when the boundaries and rules of the scientific profession were still being drawn, diverse voices contributed to the creation of scientific knowledge. It was far from a halcyon moment of equality. Margaretta and Elizabeth established their credibility against great odds, but it was still a critical moment on the path to modern science before many people were marginalized, silenced, or erased. Uncovering Margaretta's and Elizabeth's lives and work has simultaneously revealed how the process of professionalization edged out women like them, while also erasing them from historical narratives. Perhaps now, with their stories told, the Morris sisters might finally have their afterlives that were taken from them. Margaretta and Elizabeth were never alone, even if they stood out in their single-minded devotion to entomology and botany. They were surrounded by women and men who were enchanted with the sciences and eager to become literate in their environments, to look at a plant or animal and know what species it was, to name the geological formations, to predict a meteor's path. Telling Margaret and Elizabeth's story is not just about restoring them to the larger history of antebellum science. It is also about restoring the countless women who are part of the scientific community for whom so little remains. The anonymous science writers, the uncredited illustrators, the regional environmental experts, the close observers, and those who filled their waking hours with explorations and experiments, fitting them in around their other responsibilities. Through the highs and lows of their lives, the losses of family and friends, the adjustments of dreams and desires, the professional slights and triumphs, even profound national political crises, Margaret and Elizabeth had each other, and they had the Wissahickon, their book of nature, spread open before them. Just as they had as girls, as older women, they held tight to the wonder that could come with a hike through the forest and a slow afternoon in search of beetles or orchids. There was always something more to find, something new to astonish them, something that they had never noticed before that they could paint or write about, something they could share with each other and the world. Margaret and Elizabeth were working within the limits of their time, their moment in history. They had finite time and other demands on it, but they never lost the thrill of paying close attention to the world around them, bright, verdant, and alive.
That's beautiful. Verdant and alive. Catherine McNeur, what an extraordinary book. Mischievous Creatures, the Forgotten Sisters Who Transformed Early American Science, which began at the New York Historical Society Library. Thank you so much for being with us today and for this extraordinary contribution to the historical field. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie.
All right. Thank you all for joining us for this evening's fascinating conversation. We hope that you will make the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library the primary source for your next research project. And you can watch videos of our past programs via the link that you see on your screen now. Our next program will be in the reading room on Tuesday, June 11th, when Lynn Saglin joins us to discuss her new book, Times Square Remade, and how she traced the iconic public space from its earliest halcyon days as the nexus of speculation and competitive theater building past through its contested years as a hub of vice and crime. And we hope you can join us. Thank you to Catherine and Valerie for sharing their time and expertise with us tonight. And thank you all for being here and spending your evening with us. Good night.